Hello guys, this is the second video in this series where we discuss a GE paper from Delhi University's Political Science Department. This is called Introduction to Indian Constitution. In this video, we are going to discuss the first unit of this paper, and that is Constitutional Antecedents and the Making of Indian Constitution. In my opinion, this is the most difficult unit out of the whole syllabus because this has a lot of rules and dates and it makes it difficult to understand and memorize all of these things. But don't worry and stay patient because after a while it gets a lot easier to connect all of these events and it helps in understanding and memorizing the chapter. First, let's see some basic facts. India freed itself from the British rule in 1947, and after that came the need for a constitution. Before this, the Constituent Assembly was already formed in 1946. It took 2 years, 11 months and 17 days to make the Constitution of India, and this happened between 1946 to 1949. The framing of the Constitution was completed on 26 November 1949 and it came into force on 26 January 1950. But the seats for Indian Constitution were already sown way before the Assembly was even formed. There were certain events during the British rule that laid down the framework for the governance and admin structure of India. These are the events that we call constitutional antecedents. So basically these events and changes helped the country of India to develop a political system, and this system became the foundation of Indian Constitution. You will see that all of the major ideas that we see in our Indian Constitution were already enforced during the British rule, before our country even got independence. Now I have divided these events under two timelines, the Company rule and the Crown rule. The Company here is obviously East India Company and the Crown is the British monarchy. Remember that the Company and Crown are two different things. India was first under the East India Company, who came and took over the trade. After that, the power slowly started to lean more towards the Crown, the British monarchy. During this time, during the Company rule, several acts were passed that helped in bringing this political structure to our country. So the first act here is Regulating Act of 1773. This was the first step taken by the British government, the British monarch, to control the affairs of East India Company in India. The Crown wanted to increase their power in Indian administration, so they started to centralize all of this power by making some changes. But soon after that came the Pitt's India Act of 1784. This was made to correct some shortcomings from this previous act. It declared a dual control or a joint control by the British Crown and the East India Company. So the British Crown and the East India Company came together and they started to share their power and rule in India. The third act is Charter Act of 1813. This abolished the trade monopoly of the company in India. So basically before this, the trade was completely controlled by the East India Company, but now Indian trade was open to independent merchants. This act also gave permission to the missionaries to come to India and spread religious faith. This resulted in the spread of Western education among Indian inhabitants. It also made the local governments responsible for imposing tax on people. They could also punish them for not paying tax. After this came the Charter Act of 1833. This was another step towards centralization of British India. The Governor General of Bengal was made the Governor General of India. So basically he had the authority over the whole territory. It ended the activity of East India Company as a commercial body and it became a purely administrative body. So now you can see that again the power is leaning more towards the Crown. In the fifth act, that is the Charter Act 1853, we saw the introduction of competitive exams. This was done for the selection and recruitment of civil servants, and Indians were also allowed to participate. This act also separated the legislative and executive function of Governor General. So a kind of mini parliament was created by the British government. So till now we saw that these acts were passed under the Company rule. Remember guys that these weren't the only acts that were passed, there were several other acts, but these are just the most significant ones. So here we see that the British Crown is slowly trying to centralize all of the power and take over all of the political power in India. And that is exactly what happened because next came the Crown rule. So the first event here is the Government of India Act 1858. This is one of the most important acts in the development of political structure of India. This was enacted after the revolt of 1857, which ended the rule of the company, and India came under direct rule of the British Crown. The system of double government was abolished, and all of the powers were given to the Governor General, who was now known as the Viceroy of India. Then came the Indian Council Act 1861. After the 1857 revolt, the British government realized that they needed to seek the cooperation of Indians in the administration of their own country. This is country, not company. Because of this, the Indian Council Act was passed to nominate some Indian non-official members to assist the Viceroy. From now on, we will see that a process of decentralization has started in India, and soon the Crown will lose its power and India will become independent. The 8th act in this series is Indian Council Act of 1892. This increased the strength of Indian non-official members in the Legislative Council and also increased the function of the Legislative Council. They were given the power to discuss topics like finances. They could also question the executive. After this came the Indian Council Act of 1909. This is also known as Morley-Minto reforms. This introduced a considerable increase in the size of the Legislative Council. This also introduced an association of Indians who could assist the Viceroy and governors in executive function. With this act, we saw that there was an increase in the involvement of Indians in both legislative and executive council. Then came the Government of India Act of 1919. This is also known as the Montague-Chelmsford reform. A bicameral legislature was introduced for the first time. This is the central and the provincial legislature. So the legislature is divided in two parts, the central and provincial. This was made to relax the control of central governments. So we could see that slowly the center was losing its power and different territories were acquiring more power. This act also introduced direct elections, and for the first time about 10% of the population acquired the right to vote. Then came the most important act, and that is Government of India Act 1935. It is important because some call the present Indian Constitution a carbon copy of this act. This was a lengthy document with over 320 sections and 10 schedules, which served as the foundation of Indian Constitution. So basically a lot of changes were introduced in the Indian government. There was a federal structure and the power was distributed between the central and provincial government. The bicameral legislature was introduced in other parts of India as well. We could also see the principle of communal representation. So basically minority classes were getting separate electorates. So many other changes were made in the administrative structure of India, and these ideas were later seen in the Indian Constitution. And lastly came the Indian Independence Act 1947. India was finally declared as an independent country. It also resulted in the partition of India, and finally the Constituent Assembly got the power to frame and adopt our own constitution. Lastly, let's take a look at some basic facts that you need to know about the making of Indian Constitution. So the idea of a constitution was first given by M. N. Roy in 1934. In 1935, the Indian National Congress also officially demanded a Constituent Assembly to frame the Indian Constitution. Jawaharlal Nehru claimed that the assembly must only consist of Indians. Then the Cabinet Mission formed the Constituent Assembly in November of 1946. The Constituent Assembly first held its meeting in December of 1946. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the President of the Constituent Assembly. Then Jawaharlal Nehru introduced the Revolutionary Objective Resolution. This laid down the basic structure of the Constitution. This was accepted by the Assembly, and its modified version is now the preamble of the Constitution. The Constitution of India was finally made on 26 November 1949. It took approximately 3 years to make it, and the Constitution was adopted on 26 January 1950. And that's it. So yeah, this was the most difficult unit in your paper, but don't worry because you have completed it. I promise the next unit is going to be way more easier. So stay tuned for that, and for any other queries, let us know in the comments and we'll be happy to help.